Kia ora. Hello. When we are recreating an item for the purposes of reenactment, unless we have the actual item itself to copy, we must then refer to depictions or written references of that we are trying to reconstruct. This then leads us to one of the biggest issues in recreating anything from the past, understanding the context of what we are looking at while we are researching. As you will hear us say in our videos, context is king. But what do we mean by that? How do we better understand the context of what we are looking at and use to make better informed choices when building an impression? For our last video of the year, we are going to finish off another long promised video, interpreting medieval art when building an impression. I discussed this topic briefly pre-COVID times. Check out that video here to get an idea of the basic understanding of allegory and symbolism, because this week we're going to have a lot to go through and we're jumping right in. I'm Andrew, and this is Populaurbanum, a show where we discuss reenactment and the medieval middle class. Some of the biggest issues of researching is not just finding a source, but when you do, try to understand what we are looking at. Things can be represented in art and material that, when from a modern lens, are interpreted incorrectly. This is why part of my journey as a reenactor has been from a literalist to an interpretive reenactor. Now, what do I mean by that? A literalist is someone who views an image from the period they are recreating, confirms the styles depicted match what they believe to be right, and then sets about recreating the depicted item. While on the other hand, the interpretive reenactor looks to the same source, asks themselves what is being depicted, what is the context of the images, who was the art created for? These questions have an impact on how the art is viewed, and importantly, if the item in question is relevant to the impression being recreated. Is either one wrong? No, not at all. Both can use just as much academic rigor in their process. I'm usually called a fence setter in this case, but I try to be measured in my response. If I was to take a strong view, I would say the literalist is somewhat more anachronistic than the interpretive. But reenactment is anachronistic. Many things we do to facilitate reenactment is not consistent or coherent with how people lived during the periods we portray. Often we camp at events, so we need tents and cooking equipment and whatnot, which would not be analogous to the people we are displaying. That is, unless you are lucky to have a living history location to hold your event at, or you could portray people on campaign or out in the wild. We know that people did not live in tents, yet most things we do try to portray have us camping out. So unless you are portraying a soldier or a traveler or whatnot, everything we are doing is pretty anachronistic. Now that I've upset some people, back to the matter at hand. How do we understand context, and why is it actually important if we are all kind of anachronistic? If we can understand the context of items and why things are being depicted, worn or performed, this allows us to reduce the anachronisms just to the bare necessities. During the medieval period, which is the period I depict, items of clothing, held, and even hand gestures in art are part of a complex language of symbolism and allegory that people use to communicate ideas and stories. It's all well and good to make something and then hand wave away your sources because you saw it in miniature or it was on a standing stone. But my question is this: what was the context of the image? Was it fantastical, allegorical, and more importantly, does the item have any relevant extant pieces to reference or written sources to refer to? Medieval art is homogeneous for a reason. Its purpose is to communicate with the viewer an idea. It is not realist painting. In miniatures especially, what is being depicted is an illustration of what is being written about, and it is often religious in nature. Essentially, we are dealing with medieval cartoons. Even into the Renaissance, with the resurgence of classicism and realism in art, we see the use of symbolic language and allegory. Common devices to watch out for are having characters of importance larger than those around them. Minor characters may be even smaller, and we're not depicting people with dwarfism here. If the setting is in the Middle East or biblical, everyone will wear what medieval people might have thought to be ancient robes during biblical times. Saints and apostles most likely will be depicted wearing long robes, more in common with a Greek or Roman philosopher. But that's a whole other topic. If depicting Roman or ancient soldiers, they may have odd armor because medieval people did not know how to depict them. Sometimes older armor will be displayed with more contemporary pieces in an artwork, often on a saint or an old man. Again, allegory, not an example that people wore old armor into battle. Now, I'm done ranting. Let's have a look at some actual artwork and we will discuss some of the symbology. This is a depiction of the arrest of Christ by the guards of the Sanhedrin from 1380. You'll have to excuse me on this one. I'm very rusty when it comes to much of my early Christian symbology. In the center, we have Christ. And really, I don't need to explain why we know who this is. Beside him, we have Judas giving him a kiss. In his hand, we can see he has a bag which would contain his 30 pieces of silver. To the left of him, we see St. Paul, who is in the act of cutting the ear of Caiaphas, the servant of the high priest of Israel. Let's break down how I know these figures. We can identify Judas because he is depicted in the act of kissing Jesus and holding the bag of silver. We know he is one of the apostles because he has bare feet, but because he does not have a halo. He cannot be a saint. If we look to Peter, on the other hand, he is always depicted as a thick-set man with a beard, with a bald spot. He too must be an apostle because he has no shoes, and a saint because he has a halo. I can also tell he is Peter because I'm looking at the arrest of Christ and he is about to attack someone with a knife or sword, and being the other important character, Caiaphas, who has had his ear cut off, or about to. Now we know the primary figures in this image and who they are. We know the date of the image is 1380. Can we reasonably trust the clothing worn by Christ and his apostles in this image? No, it is not analogous to the period. Instead, it is symbolic to the figure. But just because the three religious figures are in this image, should we just throw the baby out with the bathwater? No. If we look at how the other people in the image are dressed, we can see that it is appropriate for the period. It is these figures that we can look to and use as reference for building an impression. But still, we must always use a critical eye. Party colour, for example, is often used to symbolize silly, frivolous people, musicians, or young people. So important was the symbolic imagery and how it was communicated. If we look to another image depicting the same event dated mid-15th century, by using our understanding of medieval symbolism, we can identify our characters from their appearance or what they carry. Again, we can identify Christ, this time sweating blood and dressed as a Franciscan. On the right, we can see St. Peter and Caiaphas wrestling mid-ear cutting, and way up the back, Judas fleeing with his money bag, and this time with a fetching red beard. While fashion of the people has changed to a more contemporary audience, we can easily identify who is important in the image and what it is about. I'm not going to comment too much on the armor here because I'm starting to fall outside of my sphere of knowledge when it comes to identifying mid-15th century things. But there are many items worn here which are accurate and others which are questionable, especially since the guards are depicted in the fashion of the grotesque. Now that we have looked at some art, I hope you can better understand that my position is not to throw out artistic representations as a tool of research. Instead, I say, understand what you are looking at. Just as we would not use a Spider-Man comic from the 70s to build an impression of how someone dressed in New York in the 70s, even though it does represent people living in that period. The comic used a lot of cultural shorthand, both visually and thematically, which would result in anachronisms. But you could use them in conjunction with other materials to achieve a good result. This is why I say, context is king. The key to helping us recreate past cultures is not just to recreate facsimiles of the items they owned, but to understand how people thought about the world and the items they possessed. If we understand how people thought and related to their material world, then we are participating in reenactment or living history, rather than just fancy dress. Hey, if you made it this far, congratulations! This is the final video of the year. We'll be back on the 10th of January after a much needed break. Enjoy your holidays and have a safe new year. Oh, hi. Still here. Means you must have enjoyed the video. So please like, comment and subscribe. And have a lovely holiday. Stay safe, have fun, and keep reenacting.